I am now pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tamara Hunter. Dr. Hunter will provide a brief introduction to LA County's mandated reporting initiative. Dr. Tamara Hunter is a seasoned professional in public child welfare with over 2 decades of experience. She currently serves as the interim executive director of the LA County Prevention and Promotion Systems Governing Committee. She is also the director of the Los Angeles County Mandated Supporting Initiative. With a doctorate from USC focusing on equity and public child welfare, Dr. Hunter is recognized for her expertise and leadership in the field. Dr. Hunter, the floor is yours. Stop my share.
Do you see my screen? All good?
Yep.
All right, great. Thank you. It's still morning, so good morning. I'm really happy to have an opportunity to be with you all today and to discuss the LA County Mandated Supporting Initiative and our work related to implementing AB 2085 in this county. I want to get started with just a bit of background information about mandated reporting. So mandated reporting is the gateway into the child welfare system. Mandated reporters make the lion's share of reports to our child protection hotline. 82.5% of all allegations of suspected abuse or neglect are made by mandated reporters here in LA County. General neglect is by far the most common allegation that's made by mandated reporters. It is also one of the most subjective and broad maltreatment allegations, and it's often conflated with poverty. And we'll get into that a little bit later in my presentation. Here in LA County, law enforcement is the top reporting sector. 24% of all reports that are made by mandated reporters are made by law enforcement. And law enforcement is one of the most, if not the most critical sector when it comes to intimate partner violence and mandated reporting. So here in California, a child's exposure to IPV is primarily classified as emotional abuse at the hotline level, but depending on circumstances, it may also be classified as physical abuse. So when we see emotional abuse allegations being made by law enforcement, they can be considered a proxy for a child being exposed to IPV. And here in LA County, 33% of all reports that are made by law enforcement allege emotional abuse. It's also really important to note that here in LA County, IPV or emotional abuse is often co-reported with general neglect and physical abuse. So mandated reporting is a deeply, deeply flawed policy response to our responsibility as a society to ensure that children are free from harm. I don't have the time to review this slide in great detail, but I do want you to take note because it lifts up some of the key factors that make reform of this policy absolutely imperative. Mandated reporting is not an evidence-based practice. And in fact, there is ample evidence of its harms and its injustices, especially for Black and Brown families and other marginalized communities. The counterproductive nature of this policy is most evident when we examine its intersection with domestic violence or intimate partner violence, wherein study after study have shown that survivors feel victimized and they feel punished for seeking help. And this causes a chilling effect and a reluctance to seek help again, which ultimately makes children less safe. Mandated reporting does not work for families, and it doesn't work for mandated reporters either. So the Mandated Supporting Initiative is LA County's effort to reform mandated reporting. It is comprised of a broad coalition of public and private cross-sector partners and change agents who are committed to making a difference. And our goal is to transform to a supportive model that prevents children from experiencing harm. That includes the harm that is caused by abuse and neglect, but also the harm that is caused by involvement with the child welfare system whenever possible. And we know that the best way to ensure that children are safe and that they thrive is to ensure that their families are well and healthy in the broadest sense possible. We also want to do a better job of providing high quality supportive services to families who are in need to prevent maltreatment in the future and to prevent DCFS involvement. And we need to do this at the mandated reporter level. The MSI, or the Mandated Supporting Initiative, also aims to eliminate mandated reporting as a driver of racial disproportionality in the child welfare system. As you may know, Black children are overrepresented in the child welfare system and experience disparate treatment at almost every critical milestone. And it all begins with a report to the hotline, where Black children are reported at 3 times their rate in the general population. And that report was more than likely made by a mandated reporter. So we acknowledge that individual level factors such as fear of personal and organizational liability, racial bias, class bias, or even paternalism do contribute significantly to the harms of mandated reporting. However, the MSI posits that we cannot focus exclusively on individual actors without taking into account the organizational and the systemic forces that shape their actions. And therefore, we believe that transformation has to occur at 3 levels: with the individual, with the organizations, and then at the systems level. And we believe that we can achieve our goals by targeting 4 key impact areas at each of these levels. And the first is with training and support. So mandated reporters feel, and they are indeed, inadequately trained and supported to carry out the profoundly consequential responsibility that they've been given. And therefore, improving the training and guidance that mandated reporters receive is a top priority of the Mandated Supporting Initiative. It is important that they have clarity and they understand their mandate, what is and what is not reportable. You'll hear about that a bit when Eve speaks. And it's also important that they are able to think critically about suspected abuse or neglect. So the MSI strategy is rooted in research and in best practices. And we know that the field of decision analysis, or decision science, tells us that we make better decisions when we employ well-designed decision support processes and tools. And therefore, our work in this area also involves implementing a decision support process for mandated reporters and developing tools that will help them make more accurate, consistent, and equitable reporting decisions. We also know that mandated reporters often make reports to the hotline just to connect families who are in need to supportive resources. And they do this without really or fully appreciating just what they may be bringing to bear on families. Mandated reporters desperately need a third option, right? So the 2 options that they have now are report or don't report. They need a third one. And this involves our building pathways to community-based preventive resources, supports, and opportunities that are at the mandated reporter level. And we know that whatever we build and whatever we put in place has to be just as easy as it is for a 3rd grade teacher to pick up the phone and make a report to the Child Protection Hotline. The 3rd pillar of our work involves law and policy advocacy. Many mandated reporters also report abuse or neglect when they don't suspect it, but they do so because they are afraid of organizational and personal liability. And therefore, we must work to rectify flawed laws and policy that influence mandated reporting in ways that are not in the best interests of kids and their families. And we really believe that mandated reporters should feel safe to make the decisions that they know are right for families without fearing for their own livelihood. So this work involves policy advocacy and implementation work, and I'll talk about that in just a bit. And the final and arguably most important pillar of our strategy is narrative change. And this really is a through line for everything that we do with the Mandated Supporting Initiative. We must change the narratives that undergird and drive the current model of mandated reporting. There is so much misinformation that is holding this problematic policy in place, and much of it is of our own making. And this is because we have conditioned mandated reporters to knowingly over-report for decades and to allow Child Protective Services to sort it out on the back end. And we've done this as though there are no consequences, although we know that that couldn't be further from the truth. I like to describe narratives as the stories that we hear, the stories that we tell, and the stories that we believe about a problem, about those impacted by it, and about what's possible in terms of resolution. So the belief that the child welfare system is the best and only pathway to ensure that kids are safe and well is a flawed narrative. And the way that we tell ourselves that those CYA reports that we tend to make are really not hurting anyone is another flawed narrative. Or the way that we cling to this failed model of mandated reporting as a necessary evil to keep children safe is yet another flawed narrative that has to be disrupted. I invite some of you to just take a moment and to really think about some of the faulty or flawed narratives about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, the stories that are told and the stories that are believed about survivors and about their children and about our capacity as a system to address it. There has to be a better way. We don't have to do things the way that we do them currently. And so the MSI is implementing a comprehensive strategy that is addressing each of these pillars in greater detail. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a recent law that was enacted, and that is AB 2085. AB 2085 went into effect in January of 2023, and it narrowed the definition of reportable general neglect in the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, or CANRA. It's really important to note that in California, general neglect is defined differently in CANRA and in the WIC code, which is where we encounter failure to protect. So AB 2085 impacted CANRA, it did not impact WIC code. So prior to the enactment of AB 2085, general neglect was defined as the negligent failure of a person having the care or custody of a child to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision where no physical injury to the child has occurred. And then after 2085 was enacted, the definition was narrowed by adding to those two circumstances that I just overviewed that a child must be at substantial risk of suffering serious physical harm or illness. So AB 2085 calls for a nexus to harm for a circumstance to be considered general neglect. And AB 2085 also makes it unequivocally clear that general neglect does not include a parent's economic disadvantage. AB 2085 was definitely a win for this work to reform mandated reporting. So now I want to talk a little bit about the legislative intent of AB 2085. So as I mentioned previously, general neglect is the most common allegation that is reported to the Child Protection Hotline. It's very subjective, it was broad, and it is often conflated with poverty, and many families are swept into the system under general neglect. And so the legislative intent of AB 2085 is to eliminate reports that are made just because families are in need or are experiencing poverty. And it aims to reduce over-reporting of families who can have their needs safely met in community by organizations that they know and they trust. The legislation also aims to reduce racial disproportionality in the child welfare system and to decrease the strain on the front end of the system that is caused by over-reporting of families who don't require Child Protective Services interventions. So although IPV is generally coded as emotional abuse at the hotline, AB 2085 is a win for survivors. The survivors that we typically see and serve in our organizations experience intersectionality. They are often from marginalized communities and struggling with poverty, and this puts them at increased risk of being the subject of a general neglect allegation and then being pushed into the system in that way, and then subsequently having their experiences with IPV raised and used against them. So AB 2085 is definitely significant for survivors. And so in closing, I just want to lift up really quickly the MSI's work to ensure that AB 2085 is implemented here in LA County with fidelity to its legislative intent. We recently released the AB 2085 mandated reporter training supplement, which operationalizes and concretizes AB 2085. The training supplement is also an introduction to the paradigm shift towards supporting families to prevent harm from abuse or neglect, and to prevent harm from involvement with the child welfare system. We have done a great deal of stakeholder engagement as part of the MSI's work. And what we hear consistently from mandated reporters when we talk about some of the consequences of over-reporting is that they did not know. They thought that it was essentially harm neutral, and if there's no abuse happening, there's no harm, no foul for anyone impacted by it. And so this training really works to disabuse them of that misconception and that flawed narrative. It impresses upon them the consequences of making a decision to report, because we want people to appreciate the severity of this decision and to recognize that it can potentially have life-altering consequences for a family. The decision to report abuse or not is one that should be made with great contemplation and great care. The training also informs mandated reporters about racial disproportionality in the child welfare system, and it speaks to the role of the biases that we all have when making reporting decisions. The training encourages mandated reporters to connect families who may be in need with supportive resources in their communities when a report to the hotline is not necessary. And believe it or not, this is novel in mandated reporter training. And we know that despite our best efforts, there will be times in which a report to DCFS is required because there are genuine child safety concerns. However, we believe that mandated reporters can still be supportive of families even when they have to make a report. And in this training, we provide strategies for doing so. Importantly, the training includes a decision support process for mandated reporters, and it includes the general neglect decision tree. So mandated reporters with a concern about general neglect should pull out their tree and answer 4 brief questions about the situation, and then they'll receive one of 3 recommendations. They'll either be recommended to contact DCFS to make a report, or to consult with DCFS if they are still unsure about the concern that they have. And the decision tree in this training gives mandated reporters that third option that I spoke about just a bit ago. The third recommendation is not to report, but consider linking a family to supportive resources in the community if they are in need. And that is what's so exciting about this training supplement. So when mandated reporters receive that third recommendation to not report, but link a family to supportive services, the training will direct them to the new MSI website, which is supportingfamilies.lacounty.gov, where they can access resources and information for families. This training is available as an e-learning or as a PowerPoint deck for organizations that wish to have instructor-led trainings that are still in alignment with the supporting families framework and paradigm shift that we are working to usher in here in LA County. The general neglect decision tree and other tools are available on the website, as is information for families. So I encourage you all to visit the website, take the training, disseminate it within your organizations, because we truly view it to be a part of the solution. And with that, I will turn the floor back over to the UCLA team.
Dr. Hunter, thank you so much. Sorry to pause us just briefly. Do you mind sharing in the chat where folks can access the training and the website that you mentioned? Thank you so much.
Alrighty, well, thank you again, Dr. Hunter, for telling us all about that training and encouraging all of us to kind of change those narratives around DV. So I'm now pleased to introduce Eve Sheedy, who will further comment on Dr. Hunter's previous conversation. Eve Sheedy is the founder of Sheedy Consulting, which specializes in intimate partner and domestic violence consulting and expert witness services. She contributes to initiatives like the Prevention and Early Intervention Committee of the California Child Welfare Council and the leadership group of the LA County Mandatory Supporting Initiative. She has led legislative changes and received recognition from various organizations for her impactful work. Eve, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you maybe got to see a little bit of the eclipse with specialized glasses on, of course. But I want to say thank you to everybody at Pritzker. Thanks to Tamara, the other panelists, and all of you for joining us today. I do not have slides, so I'm just going to chat with you for a few minutes about sort of trying to touch a number of bases. First, I want you to be, it's important you're aware that the phenomenal efforts being led by Tamara in Los Angeles County are actually part of a sort of statewide initiative to address, I think, as Tamara so beautifully said, a deeply flawed system of mandatory reporting. So there is an entity called the California Child Welfare Council, which was created by statute to be an advisory group with regards to children's safety and child welfare. They have a whole bureaucratic system that has a committee, what's called the Prevention Intervention Committee. And under that committee, they submitted a number of recommendations, which were accepted by the Welfare Council, one of which is the creation of a statewide task force, which both Tamara and Arati, who is one of the panelists, are members of. And that task force is addressing issues related to mandatory reporting. The task force, as I said, is statewide. It seeks to include not only, people from government, survivor voice, voices of people in all sorts of areas that touch child welfare and so forth. And they are, through a series of subcommittees, examining issues related to mandatory reporting, and they will submit recommendations back to the Child Welfare Council and so forth. So this issue about really addressing the false narrative of mandatory reporting is something that's going on throughout the state. So these efforts, obviously what happens, I think, in Los Angeles is critically important given the size and the scope. And I really, really applaud Tamara. It's very hard. I've worked there. It's very hard to get something done. So she's really done an amazing job. There are two caveats I want to say. One is when we talk about the intersection of domestic violence and child welfare, or really about any of these really critical policy issues, there's a tendency to say, well, what about this case? And it's the worst case scenario. Okay, so we can all bring in horrible cases on any subject, and those cases are critically important, and I'm not dismissing their importance. But when we talk about the development of law and policy, we really want to talk to how do we impact the greatest number of people, the majority of people who are being impacted in a certain way, in a fair and just way. So we have to look beyond a very specific, we can all sort of get to that point and really look at what is our system doing, generally speaking, to our society as a whole. And second of all, when you start to talk about domestic violence and child welfare, there is very often a tendency to pit those things against each other. Some of this stems from failure to protect laws. Some of this stems, my personal opinion, is from perhaps a misunderstanding of what protective conduct in the context of domestic violence may look like, what survivors are being subject to in these relationships, and so forth. But it is not, we are not pitted against each other. Everybody wants the safety of children and the safety of survivors. And we can get to that point together without creating some unnecessary, I think, tension between those two fields. So it's important, I think, to put those things aside. I'm going to give you a couple more statistics, which I think underscore what Tamara was saying. And when we look at the statewide data, it's, as she said, 3 times more Black and Indigenous children are reported and brought into the child welfare system 3 times more than white children. So on its face, it disproportionately impacts huge populations of our state in ways that are just simply unacceptable and cannot go forward. We have an obligation to make sure that our systems, and in particular our governmental systems, are fair, right? So this is on its face not fair. On a statewide basis in 2022, of over 441,000 reports of abuse and neglect, 12% were substantiated. So that means 88% were not. So if you took any system or any work that you do in your day-to-day life and you were right 12% of the time, you wouldn't probably be in the job you're in, okay? So it is a system that's not really working. And I understand there are many reasons why something may not be substantiated. But the reality is the system that we have come to rely upon is not giving us the results that we need. So we have a system that's operative, but it's not getting us to safety. It's not bringing the cases that we needed to bring to the system, and it's not fair. So we really have to, as Tamara said, change this narrative. So, okay, so in DV, I'll give you, there was a study done, and unfortunately it's old because there's not a tremendous amount of domestic violence child welfare data for various reasons. But in 2015, there was a study of survivors who they connected to through the national hotline. So it was about 2,462 survivors, so almost 2,500 survivors. 35% of respondents to that survey did not ask for help from at least one person due to mandatory reporting laws. And many of them reported that they were fearful that their children would be taken away. So when we look at domestic violence survivors, who ideally we want to have a system that enables survivors with children to reach out to supportive services that can help them, we've created a system which has caused them fear to do that. So that when they go to that system where we want them to go to seek help, to agencies that have expertise, many of you probably work in those agencies, when they go there, they are then at risk. And they're at risk of ending up into a system which is then may say to them, you know, when you were being victimized, you were really at fault because you weren't protecting your children. So we've really created something that is fraught, or something that is designed in many ways to keep people away from help-seeking conduct. On an individual level, for survivors, it can be very often, at least in my experience, talking to survivors, and I by no means am trying to take away anybody's voice or anything like that, but I've had a lot of interaction with survivors in these settings, and it is often the beginning of a loss of hope, which is something that as people move forward can be the most devastating moment in someone's life, when they finally may just give up. And it ends up, once you're taking someone's children or threatening to take someone's children, it can lead to a number of other horrible consequences for somebody who really could have been helped through other resources in the community. So on a very basic level, it, as Tamara mentioned, this can interfere, mandatory reporting can interfere with the development of a therapeutic relationship, right? So if you go to get counseling and the first thing your counselor says to you is, you know what, and if you say this, I have to call, Child Protective Services, that does not give rise to an open conversation, right? Just on its face, because everybody is on edge. The person who has chosen to provide these services has usually done so because they have a tremendously caring heart and really want to help, and they are sort of backed into a corner. And the survivor who wants to be able to share what's going on in their life is also backed into a corner. It also, as you know, if you work with survivors, ends up confirming what the person causing harm has been saying, right? Which is, you're a bad mother, no one's going to believe you, and so forth. So all of these things that have been part of the abuse, the cycle of abuse, are now being sort of taken over by the government entity or by the system that we have developed to address it. So it becomes very difficult for survivors to get out from under that, right? Because that's sort of the echo of the abuse that's going on. It also brings someone into the system, which in and of itself can be a terrifying experience, but it also provides them, then they have, whether it's substantiated or unsubstantiated, there's a report, right? So let's say it's unsubstantiated. So let's say there's 3 unsubstantiated reports. So when that happens and people see that record, then that negatively impacts the survivor's capability of moving forward, even though they did nothing, right? So again, so it's a systemic flaw, right? And then if we recognize the impact of children being exposed to violence, right? What we want is to put them in the best possible situation to heal, right? And that is by keeping that protective parent with them, right? They can, in fact, heal from that. And they need to do that in a way. We have to have a system which encourages the development of resilience, right? We don't want to pull them apart from maybe the one person in their life who is giving them some stability and care. And, I think, as we said, we can't, as a society, allow these systems to go forward. If we know, as we know about mandatory reporting, that this is essentially a system that is racist in effect, we have to stop. Okay, we can't say we'll deal with this 2 years from now. We need to do that right now. Okay, we can't do that. We can't do that. We just can't do that. And then I'm probably talking too long. I'm going to talk about SB 1126. So there's a new bill, not that new, it's actually going to committee hearing tomorrow, SB 1126, which is designed to look upstream with regards to survivors, address mandatory reporting in sync with some of the efforts that are going on. And basically what it says is that the fact that a child witnessed domestic violence or was present during a domestic violence incident does not require a mandatory report. Okay, so it has nothing to do with if the child's being harmed or this or that. It's only if there's a witnessing or they're present in the household where it's going on. So the bill is essentially designed to clarify reporting responsibilities, right? Mandatory reporting responsibilities. There are people in the field who feel in many situations that I just described that they don't have to report, and others feel they do have to report. And as Tamara said, some of this issue of how do we decide who how the reporters decide what to do causes tremendous stress even on their part, right? So we're trying to clarify exactly what that responsibility. It would allow for, as we discussed, the open communication between people offering services and people seeking services. If there was not that threat of needing to make that mandatory report, and it can put people in a situation where they can protect and protect their children actually, better, that they can actually stay as the protector of their child. What's important to understand is it is not intended, and I think it is, as a bill, it becomes, right, it's politics, right? It becomes political. No one by this bill is seeking to put any child at risk. What we are trying to do is to improve services for survivors and their children, to strengthen them and to strengthen community-based resources who are providing services. Understand, if you go into a child protective service, they're not a direct service agency, right? So they may well be sending people to these same agencies, but it's only after they've entered that system and all that comes along with that, right? So let's go to the first instance and support the relationship that people have when they're seeking services. And it doesn't end up putting a survivor in a situation where they end up being punished under failure to protect laws for being victimized, right? So they are not in a situation where they ultimately have to say, I wasn't the person who was causing the violence, and, I don't know what you wanted me to do in that setting, but I certainly wasn't doing anything to try to endanger my children. So the law is at the public safety hearing tomorrow, and it would be wonderful if you could all support it. It's SB 1126, and ultimately it is, there are many areas throughout the child welfare system that impact survivors, which call for change. And this bill is not intended to address them all, right? It's intended to go to sort of this issue about mandatory reporting, and it's really sort of step one, right, in a period of longer change. And we hope that through the work of Pritzker, through the work of the county and Tamara, through the work of the other people on the panel, that we really create a system where people who work with survivors and people who work in child welfare will work together to provide safety and support for these families, and really stop really pitting each other against each other, because that's not helping. With that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Eve. Before we kind of transition to our panel, do you mind sharing that study you mentioned, the 2015 one, to our audience members? I think a few were asking in the chat.
I have it. Can I do this? Can I send you? I'll tell you this. I mean, if you Google Casey Family Foundation and domestic violence, it'll come up. It's cited in one of their briefs, the actual study. So it'll come up that way. And in the meantime, I'll send the information, the actual study information, to Brittany. And if you're interested in additional statistics with regard to statewide child welfare stats, I'm going to put a site, which is the Child Welfare Indicators Project at Berkeley. And you can find some data there, because data's hard. It's not DV data, but data's hard to come by. And I'll get you that other site.
Alrighty, sounds
good.
And
I wanted to say, can I say one other thing? So Arati, who's a panel member, is also working on SB 1126. And if there's a moment, if she wanted to add anything, I think that would be helpful.
Yes, and there's also a question if there's a link to support the bill during public comment tomorrow.
As of right now, there's no direct way other than being there in person to provide additional support. From what I understand, they're not taking calls, and the deadline to submit letters of support has passed. So unfortunately, I'm not aware of a way to express support for the hearing tomorrow, but fingers crossed it will get through and there will be additional ways as it continues to move forward. So we'll be able to do that as well. And in terms of just adding anything, I mean, it was already incredibly well said by Eve, and I'm happy to maybe address more about it if people have questions or in the panelist questions, because I know we're going to talk about it a little bit more there as well.
Yeah, we will now transition to the panelists. Is a good time. So thank you both, Dr. Hunter and Eve, for setting the stage for us and giving us the context to the important work that's happening in LA County right now. I would now like to introduce the rest of the panel who provide their personal and professional experiences when it comes to mandatory reporting. Screen here. Alrighty. So Sophia Rodriguez is the Director of Clinical Operations at the WYCA of San Gabriel Valley, where she oversees the Domestic Violence Expert Program that is currently working alongside the LA County DCFS Child Protection Hotline. Arati Vasan has been a Senior Managing Attorney at the Family Violence Apatow Project since 2018. In her role, she represents survivors of family and gender-based violence on appeal, manages FVAP's training programs, and provides technical assistance to attorneys and advocates. And Jacqueline Herrera, a survivor of domestic violence, now serves as a parent partner at Los Angeles Dependency Lawyers. Drawing from her own experiences, she supports clients with open cases with DCFS, ensuring their journey through the dependency system is as smooth as possible. We now have a few questions for all of you, and so feel free to chime in whenever you'd like. And if the audience has any direct questions, we will take note and share with you guys at the end. So, to start our panel, the first question is, if a provider is concerned about a child's exposure to domestic violence, how could they take a mandatory supporting approach rather than reporting the situation? Would they face potential legal repercussions for not reporting?
Tamara, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I didn't know if I was on the panel or not. Am I on the panel?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry for the awkward pause. I'm happy to start things off and certainly invite other panelists to weigh in. I think the first thing that mandated reporters need to know is that exposure to domestic violence in and of itself is not maltreatment, and it doesn't categorically warrant a report. The concerned mandated reporter should make an effort to connect that family to supportive resources, if possible, to mitigate the concern that they have. But if they continue to be concerned that a child's exposure to domestic violence may be maltreatment, again, I'm going to just say this over and over again, the decision to make a report or not make a report should be handled with great care because it's a life-altering decision. I think there are some steps that we outline in our training supplement that the mandated reporter should follow in this instance. They should try to obtain additional information, just clarify and better understand their concern. This is not the same as investigating. They should also consider their point of view and do a self-check for bias. And whenever possible, they should consult with colleagues about this concern and any potential bias that may be showing up. And then if after this careful deliberation, they still have concerns or they reasonably suspect that that child is being abused, then they should contact DCFS and have a conversation with them.
Yeah, I can add, sorry, I didn't know if I was just waiting. I didn't want to step on anybody else's toes. Yeah, I think the question presumes that you can come up with an approach that's independent of the situation. And I think that's part of the problem, unfortunately. And the idea that you need to be concerned about the legal repercussions even as you're thinking about this, is why this is a very flawed system to begin with. Because thinking about the legal repercussions to yourself immediately puts a thumb on the scale towards reporting. And it immediately suggests that somehow you have to put yourself at risk in order to protect somebody else. And that entire thought process allows for bias and encourages over-reporting. I think what Dr. Hunter suggested is admirable, and I think it's very, very difficult for anyone to actually do that. The level of self-awareness we need to have first and foremost about our own biases, the amount of time that it would take to do that is another thing. And again, you know, for some folks, the line between what's investigating and what's clarifying is very clear. And for a lot of folks, it's not at all. And the training on this issue is all over the place. And so, again, it puts the thumb on the scale of just going ahead and reporting. I think that a mandatory supporting approach really has to look at the idea of the support versus the mandatory, right? Because what does it mean to actually support someone, right? And that's what this is. It's supporting someone. We're talking about individuals. We're not talking about supporting an institution. We're not talking about supporting a system. We're not talking about supporting generalized notions of safety and welfare, or even legal definitions of safety and welfare. We're talking about supporting individuals. And how can you honestly do that if you don't have communication and relationship with that person? And even in building that communication and in relationship with the person, you bring your humanness to that, and your subjectivity, and your bias, and your experience. So, you know, part of the reason why this particular bill exists is to prevent entering the pipeline in the first place, because there's just too many ways in which it goes wrong. And there's too many variables that have no accountability and that are too subjective. And so really, you know, it's not to say that, again, that there's, that we're trying to ignore harm to a child. But I think that understanding that this particular construct, I think, which is Dr. Hunter has said so eloquently, the basic construct of this idea that a mandatory report system needs to happen. There needs to be a criminal law which provides penalties against someone if they don't report in a very specific way, using a specific form to a very specific authority, and that's our best way of handling this system. Having that, even if you make adjustments to that, you're not addressing that basic flaw. And so to me, I think that I guess that's how I would reframe it a little bit, is sort of suggesting, well, the premise behind the question still sort of suggests that you need to have some sort of mandatory action system that involves eventually a possibility of connecting with child welfare under the same scheme that you have a mandatory reporting system. And I think that we need to question that.
Well, anyone feel free to comment on that as the panel goes on, but we have an additional question kind of talking about these like the bills that are coming up and expanding these supporting practices. So do you think there's any barriers in kind of expanding these practices, and why do you think these barriers exist?
I'll say something. I think one of the biggest barriers is money, right? So like, I think there are barriers to really providing resources throughout our communities, particularly communities that are marginalized as a rule, where there may not be sufficient services. So I think that part of it is really refocusing to address, I agree with Arati that it's a larger kind of change. We really have to look to individuals in the community who we want to help and build those services where they are, and that's what they need. And that's a massive commitment. So I think that's one of the barriers, is really sort of turning the ship around, so to speak.
I mean, again, I think I don't understand how you can not have a barrier when you pit people against each other. And that's what this system does, right? It pits reporters against the people who need help. It pits services against the people who need help. It pits the child welfare system against people who might need help. So it creates this by using this sort of stick approach and involving the criminal justice system, which you know, the connections between the criminal justice system and the child welfare system are something that, you know, if you have the time to read more about, I think it's really illuminating, because, you know, we talk a lot about what the criminal justice system has done to create harm. And when you look at some of the philosophical underpinnings of that system, and you compare that with some of the philosophical underpinnings of just the way the design is of the child welfare system, I'm not talking about the people involved in it, I'm just talking about the way that the system itself is designed, you see the connections and the parallels, and it's based on very similar ways of flawed thinking, right? Which is that we need to be policing each other based on values that are externally created, that we are in a position to decide who's deserving and who's not deserving, and that we can look at something external in writing and help make that determination without bias. I mean, these are all sort of, again, broader concepts that may not feel like something you can do anything with in your day-to-day, but that's why having something as simple as "you're not required to" helps keep it clearer, right? It gives you a position, it gives you an opportunity then to take away that that sword hanging over your head that says that if you don't do it a certain way, you're risking a lot of things. And one of the things that's interesting, and I know Dr. Hunter has talked about this in other spaces, and we've talked about it before, is that it doesn't even have to be an actual likelihood of happening. It doesn't have to actually be a genuine fear, right? It's even the idea of it, or the mythology of what could happen, has been enough to stimulate reporting, right? Nobody is necessarily going around and saying, will you actually lose your license, right? And proving that someone actually will, because it's not there, right? But it's the idea of it, it's the possibility of it. And as long as that possibility is superior in our minds and in our hearts to what could happen by someone entering the system, you know, we'll never be able to actually completely look at it completely from the perspective of what does this family need? Because there's always going to be this other thing in there. So I think, you know, that in and of itself is a barrier, right? That in and of itself is a barrier, because you're automatically, again, putting a thumb on the scale in the other direction. I think another barrier, just to echo what Eve said, is the fact that we have this sort of kind of warped way in which we think about services, right? So the domestic violence movement in and of itself has created all these services, right? We have shelters, we have advocacy programs, that type of thing. And then there's an influx of money that's come into that system from law enforcement, largely law enforcement based or crime prevention based, right? And there are intersections between those two systems. But the movements itself, in terms of the services and things like that, has always been serving the client, and the client is the survivor and their child and their children, right? Unlike a lot of other systems, which have other people that they are responsible for. But when those systems become used by government systems as a way of enforcing rules and enforcing those protocols, you change the dynamic of it. You know, one of the things that I think was really important about something that the Pritzker study did, and just thank you again, Pritzker and Taylor and everyone for this opportunity, and also just really, really honored to be on this panel with everyone, is they talked about how much of a reliance there was on domestic violence services to do the work of the service provision. And yet, at the same time, they were being asked to be accountable to the county and to child welfare authorities for the work that they were doing, when their primary objective is actually the client, right? And so it ends up sort of pitting the service providers and puts them in a really difficult position, mainly because once you're entering the system, and then the system is using the service referral as a way of measuring whether someone is deserving of keeping their kids or not, then you put that service again, you put that service in a really difficult position when it actually, they could have had that service all along without the intervention of the county in the first place, right? And so again, I think that when you sort of say, well, this person has to do these things, but these are the services we're going to use, and then we're going to measure your use of those services and how you did those services as a way of judging whether you have insight or whether you're deserving or whether you've complied with our rules. You actually warp the system a bit too that's designed to help them. So there's a way, again, as has been talked about over and over again, and I don't want to talk so much anymore, but where those services and those systems are there and are in a position to be able to help someone that doesn't require the involvement of child welfare at all.
I want to know if I'm able to share my experience when it came to making my phone call to the law enforcement. Give me a minute. So some people aren't sure who qualifies as a mandated reporter, right? In my experience, when I called law enforcement after a domestic violence incident and shared my current situation, I explained how difficult it had been for me to seek for help, because I fear my situation would be reported to the authorities. I didn't know that the police were actually mandated reporters and will refer this incident to the DCFS review for my family. I told the officer I had heard stories of the victims who had been reported to the Child Protective Services and had their children taken away from them. I didn't want to risk losing my children, so I stayed in silence for many years, enduring the abuse in silence. I didn't know the cop was going to tell my story to the DCFS. Now my fear was a reality, and a few days later, DCFS was at my doorstep. I created a safety plan for my family with my oldest son. We discussed what to do if the situation escalated. He needed to grab his youngest brothers and seek help from our neighbors. I gave him a 30-minute time frame, and if the police didn't arrive by then, he needed to contact them with the help of our neighbors. I'm just grateful that social worker gave me the chance to keep my children with me while also seeking a shelter. With the support of my therapist and the advice of my support groups, as a result, my children were never taken away from me. I'm proud of myself for overcoming difficult circumstances in my life. I just hope that one day the system can find a way to strike a balance between mandatory reporting and survivor-centered care so that everybody can receive the support they need to heal, thrive, and have a positive outcome. It would be helpful to have a system where individuals can speak up without the fear of having their children taken away from them. This way, they can save themselves before it's too late. I feel that I didn't know, when I was trying to escape from this relationship I didn't know this was going to happen to me. So I made the phone call and all this came, and my family was now suffering, had an open case. So that was my experience when it comes to mandated reporting. Not everybody knows certain professionals are mandated reporters.
Thank you for sharing with us, Jacqueline. And I want to ask Sophia also if you have anything to mention as well, and Jacqueline, please continue to add, and that was really powerful.
I think something really important when we address barriers, well, yes, thank you, Jacqueline, for sharing your story. It's very powerful. I do want to point out that as a provider and a domestic violence advocate myself, one of the barriers we face as mandated reporters is Dr. Hunter pointed out that currently the options are to report or not report. And so definitely being aware of the harm that it could potentially cause families, it really does put a difficult situation, and it does take time to sit back and really identify the help needed and how to help and how to support the families access the help that they need. And I think Eve mentioned the importance of having different avenues and having these supportive services available, because as providers, we can provide, for example, the YWCA, we have a domestic violence shelter here in LA County. And so we have the clients come into the domestic violence shelter. They are no longer in the DV situation, but do we have the resources and the support to help them get to that next step? And a lot of times we face barriers, and we face the barriers alongside the victims to access the support. So it definitely comes down to the services being available to the families outside of having to make that report, because a lot of times the families that are have access to resources that maybe families that don't, where they face additional barriers as well in terms of getting that service and help in those services.
I would just like to add it, since we've talked a bit about systems, and I want to thank Jacqueline for sharing that. You understand, someone ultimately calls the police for help, which has likely been threatened that if they do that, that will cause them and their children harm. And then the police report them to DCFS or to Child Protective Services. So you now have a human being who is in crisis, right? Who is part in this relationship, who from one system, from the criminal justice system, that's their witness. So I've been both a defense lawyer and a criminal prosecutor. That the state is saying, okay, our case is dependent on you and we need you to come testify. And then in another government system, they're essentially prosecuting that person, right, based on the same conduct. So they're saying, okay, you're the key witness in our criminal case to get to this person, but also we want you to know you're terrible as a mother and we're taking your children. And so we cannot have a system that does that to someone who is in harm's way, right? And they're failing. And like Jacqueline mentioned, so many survivors have emergency plans with their children, have discussed things with their children, have taken care of their children, and oftentimes those protective practices that they engage in are not recognized and supported within the system. So I think that a lot of it is like I said before, is a lack of understanding or knowledge about what is actually happening to that family. And as Sophia said, what we want is people to help that family, not to have them, tear them apart. So I think it's really critical that we focus on building up those parts of the system and those entities that really support those children and those survivors.
Can I just add one quick thing to that? And just also wanted to say thank you so much, Jacqueline. And it also, again, just speaks to a situation that I feel like I have worked with a lot, which is where clients that I represent actually seek out child welfare authorities thinking that they're going to be in a position to get help, and find that that's not actually effective in helping their situation. But I think one thing too, to when we're talking about services, I think one of the tricky pieces, again, and why it's important to stop things before they even get through the door, is that, again, as is pointed out, that generally the child welfare authority system is not set up to provide direct services, right? They connect with services. But when you treat services as a kind of gauntlet that someone has to go through, and only if they jump over each hurdle and jump through each hoop, and they do it in the right way, and they do it without making any mistakes, then only can they be deserving, right, of either keeping their children or getting their children back. That's not service provision in a way that's client-centered or empowered or trauma-informed. That's, again, just another form of coercion. And I think it's incredibly important that we stop looking at service provision through government entities as a kind of support, when there is that coercive aspect to it, when there is that overlying threat there, right? When one wrong move, you know, someone goes to the same organization to sign up for a parenting class as the other parent goes to, and instead of being celebrated for signing up for a parenting class, they're told that they are deliberately going to that parenting class because they're trying to have contact with the other person. Or someone is told that because they are continuing to engage in domestic violence services, they're still too attached to the other person, or too enmeshed, or lack insight, or are likely to go back, or are likely to get into another domestic violence situation. These are the kinds of things that show up in petitions, in warrants, in reports, in notes. And it's ridiculous that we allow a system that allows for that kind of, frankly, casual bias and I think largely unsubstantiated analysis, all right, and assumptions, and things that maybe because of lack of resources are not actually investigated, to be taken as fact without accountability. And then that's used to destroy people, destroy them. I mean, the harm that comes from investigation, temporary removal, right? There's a lot of this, well, you know, if nothing's really going on, they won't be removed. But the harm of those things are not things that you just recover from, right? We talk a lot about building resilience. How do you build resilience against removal? How do you build resilience against being separated and put in foster care? Right? How do you build resilience from that? How do you recover from those things? And yet we're willing to say that that's okay for the purposes of this other idea, which is where, you know, we can determine better than a person who's experienced the violence what they will or will not do, or what they understand and don't understand, or what, you know, words they use or actions they'll take based on our idea of how someone who experiences domestic violence should behave and should parent and should act and should say and should speak.
Thank you all for that. And kind of like our last type of questions, and we'll go to audience questions that we've collected throughout the talk. I think, Sophia, could you explain the hotline to helpline program, and how does that differ from traditional either reporting routes or supportive services? And also anyone can feel free to answer this.
So the hotline to helpline program, actually, I think somebody else would probably do a little bit of a better job with that. I think one of the areas that I did want to jump in is the training in terms of the current hotline that the YWCA is providing as a domestic violence experts in the topics that we have covered for the people receiving the call, the children's workers at the hotline, being able to screen the domestic violence calls. And so I think on that end, that's where our agency comes into this component. Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to chime in, but I do think that this audience would be most interested in hearing about the Hotline's Domestic Violence Project. The Hotline to Helpline and the Domestic Violence Project are two separate programs that are operated out of the hotline. I'll really quickly talk about Hotline to Helpline, but I think that everyone should hear what Sophia has to say about the DV project, because it's really exciting. So the Hotline to Helpline is a program that DCFS operates to safely defer families away from the hotline. So when a report is made about a family that does not meet the statutory requirement for an in-person investigation by DCFS, but that family appears to be in need. So when reports come in that don't require DCFS involvement, but appear to be indicative of a family in need of supportive services, the hotline will refer that family to a community-based organization, a local CBO, who will outreach and hopefully engage that family and connect them to services that they may need or want. To Arati's point, what makes this program so special is that it's not coercive. A family is free to accept the services or not. DCFS uses an MDT process to make a referral to a CBO, and then they are out of it. That CBO reaches out and engages that family. So that is the Hotline to Helpline program. That's one way that DCFS is trying to reduce bringing families into the system who don't need CPS involvement. They also operate a fairly new domestic violence project that Sophia can talk about.
Yes. Okay, and I'll go ahead and jump in. So in March of 2023, the YWC of San Gabriel Valley became the domestic violence expert agency for LA County Department of Children and Family Services. And a lot of the discussion that we had today really highlighted the need for the beginning of collaborative work towards making these changes. And we really are at the beginning stages of this. And we did start by through the development of a program. One component that we mentioned is the training of our hotline children's social workers. And so we worked alongside DCFS to develop a training specific for their workers. And the training does cover everything from cycle of violence, to why it is difficult to leave an abusive relationship and why don't people just leave, and really we engage in the conversation. And I will say that the last couple trainings I've sat in and observed, there is discussions taking place, and the children's workers are asking these questions, and they are wanting to know how they can best handle these situations. And so I think a lot of it is, as we talked about before, is having these trainings available. And we are hopeful that this is only the beginning stages of the training. Along with the training piece of us going in and working with the hotline, we also provide individualized case reviews. And so the goal is that every call through DCFS where there is a domestic violence component, it goes to our 2 domestic violence experts. They review the case and they provide recommendations and referrals. One of the things that we talked about, a barrier that survivors of domestic violence face, is accessing services. And so currently we have over 1,000 providers in LA County that are resources that we provide to the survivors in over 150 zip codes. And so that really speaks about trying to help break down the barriers in terms of accessing services. We also provide case consultations for workers. Our 2 domestic violence experts, both of which are in this here with us in the chat, hopefully they can chime in, but the 2 they are available for phone calls to discuss specific cases. And we've also been referred clients who are experiencing it. The worker will say, here, I will connect you to the DV experts, and we've actually walked them through accessing these services. Again, this is just the beginning. In this last year, we reviewed over 4,000 cases. That's 4,000 families that we've been able to help navigate services as survivors of domestic violence who are also navigating a child welfare system. Again, this is just the beginning of our project. We are in year 2. We just started in March, but we are very hopeful that we're starting to address all of these needs that are coming up. And again, this is just the beginning. It is a large undertaking, but we are really proud of the fact that we've been able to come in and really just have a voice for the survivors, because before anything, we are domestic violence advocates, and we are going to speak for the individuals that we work with and the individuals that we serve.
Thank you so much for all that information, Sophia. I know people in the chat are a bit active about that. So we now have a couple minutes for some audience questions. You guys have been answering a lot of them so far, so I'll ask one right now. Someone said, what are some suggestions on how to protect and support children when the victims of the DV continue to allow the perpetrator access to themselves and their children, despite being given supportive services?
Okay, I'm going to start. I think that the phrase allow is not accurate. There are tremendous levels of both actual and threatened conduct for survivors seeking to leave relationships. Survivors are at tremendous risk of being killed when they leave a domestic violence relationship. So the concept that somebody can just walk out the door and all is good is not really supported by what the actual experience of survivors is. Many survivors are threatened with harm to their children if they should leave and so forth, and to family members. And it becomes both a difficult decision, and also when you talk about, let's talk about Los Angeles, where nobody has housing, okay, and nobody can afford to have housing. So if you've got somebody in a relationship with children who may not be, maybe they're not working, or they're working at a job that, you know, their household requires 2 incomes, or any sort of situation, the concept of being able to walk out the door and start over just doesn't make sense and is not really an option. So sometimes I think we say, or systems will say, here's your option, but the reality for that person is that's not an option. Okay, then, and I'm talking about, in that example, someone who speaks English, it can get a job potentially and so forth, without all of the added stressors that come for people with additional barriers to accessing sort of the systems that we have in place. So I think that we talk about allowing, I think you really have to look at every family as as individual families, and what's going on there, and what are really the options that people have when they are in a violent relationship. And instead of looking at what they're not doing, I think it's very critical to look at what they are doing. And are there things that survivors are doing within those households that are in fact protecting their children? And what are they do? Are they the people who are making sure the children go to school? Are they the people who are actually making sure there is care? Are they the people who are remembering the child's birthday? Are they the people? There is all sorts of conduct that goes on, even within the framework of relationships where there's violence, where there's tremendous protective parenting going on by those people. So I think when we say allow, that really, that the survivor is allowing that access, I think it suggests that there's no coercion by one party to the other, and it suggests that there's some level of equality of action that likely does not exist in that relationship. So I think it's really important to, like we've all talked about, increase the understanding and the ability to look at those relationships and understand the conduct as it's occurring, so that people are given credit for everything that they're doing, even under difficult circumstances.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, again, to me, that approach is indicative of the approach that the system has taken generally, and even the law enforcement system, other systems take towards this issue of domestic violence, that there's a level of complicity and culpability on behalf of all domestic violence survivors in their own abuse. And you can say that that's not actually what someone's thinking, but that's exactly what the whole process of failure to protect implies. Right. And the whole process of, oh, you stayed, or, oh, this idea that there's this binary of you either stay or you leave, and you either cut off all contact or you're part of the problem is an approach that I think has been taken by many government systems and seen as the solution for the issue of domestic violence. And yet the social science, the evidence, the actual facts of what works for kids and what works for families and what works to help reduce domestic violence show that kind of binary, that kind of approach, that kind of treatment of someone, that they are complicit in their own abuse and can be complicit in their own abuse, is actually ineffective. And people know when they're being treated that way, right? It doesn't matter how much sympathy or empathy or kindness you show. People can tell when you're really judging them, right? People see it. So, we can say that we're providing choices and options and providing support, but when you're really telling someone, if you don't act this way, you're not the right kind of survivor, you're not the right kind of parent, you're not doing what I've told you you need to do in order to be good enough to keep your kids, which is really what ends up happening in these situations. People understand that and they take that very seriously, and it's harmful.
Unfortunately, our time is wrapping up. I know there's a lot of audience questions, and we will definitely take them down for all the panelists, and we'll compile them all for you and get everyone connected as appropriately. But thank you all so much for all your expertise and your lived experience and all of the trainings and all of the links and research for just the audience and just myself as well as a learning experience. And you left us with a lot to consider. So thank you all of you speakers, audience for joining us today. The next session we'll have next Monday, April 15th at 11:30 at the same Zoom link. For more information, you can sign up at the LA Learning site link. And as always, we invite your feedback and additional questions. So please fill out this link to the survey that we will place in the chat. But yeah, if any other panelists have anything else to add as a last minute thing, but otherwise we will wrap up.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We greatly appreciate your presentations today. With that, our training is complete. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.